Welcome back. We are in the final leg of the GCVI Summit. We have a treat for you. For those of you sticking around, by the way, thank you very much. And I recognize that travel these days is very challenging. Not as challenging as going up into space, as I was imagining, but going to airports these days cannot be fun, and thank you very much for you and Andrea and that trek you made from Houston. So Bernard and Ken are going to join us on stage today. They're going to have a deep dive into the ways in which corporates can partner up with traditional venture and, more importantly, get an astronaut's perspective. So thank you very much, Astronaut Bernard Harris, for being here from Non-Sibi Ventures with Kent. Thank you so much. Take your seats. We'll get right into it. What an honor, right? What an honor. What an honor. Astronaut Bernard Harris. I can say that again, right?
Yes. Great. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Christina, amazing. Brooklyn, Queens, we're all aligned. It's great. So Non-Sibi Ventures is an early stage venture fund. We invest seed and Series A primarily in 3 buckets: AI, industrial tech, and sustainability/resiliency. Ideally, we find a deal that overlaps with 2 of those. I'm based in Houston, and I moved to Houston about 5 years ago, and Bernard was one of the first people that I was introduced to. Started out as a friend and a mentor, and on the advisory board of our Fund 1. And then the funny story is that Fund 2, last fall, he's like, hey, I want to do more. And I'm like, Bernard, you're super busy, as you will find out. You have all these things going on. He says, no, I want to lean in more to you guys and what you're doing. And I'm like, okay. So we pushed him, and here he is. Incredible background, as you'll hear. First African-American in space, 7.2 million miles out there. He's got great stories of being out in the shuttle, et cetera. But we are fortunate to have him as part of our team. So with that, please tell more about your background and how your background and pathways led you to space.
So I was one of those kids who was fascinated with science and science fiction. And I have to admit, because I heard some people talk about sci-fi the last couple of days, I was an original Star Trek fan and later became a real-life fan in space and followed the space program, and this is in the 60s. 1969, we landed on the moon, and I saw Neil and Buzz, and I said, that's what I want to do. And I remember going to my mother, and who was an educator, and she was big on education and big on asking us, you know, what do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to do when you grow up? And I finally had something to tell her. I said, Mom, I know what I want to do when I grow up. And she said, what is it? I said, I want to be an astronaut. And she said, that's nice. And just sort of walked on off. And then I think something came to her mind and said, wait a minute, this is an opportunity, a learning opportunity. So she turned back and told me that I could be and do anything that I wanted to be in life, and that's all I needed. My mom said I could be an astronaut, I could be an astronaut. When I got to high school, though, and I looked at, what field I would choose to be an astronaut, I saw this guy by the name of Joe Kerwin, who was the first physician astronaut, American physician. The Russians again beat us. They had the first physician astronaut in space. But Joe Kerwin became my mentor. He was a flight surgeon and then later became an astronaut and then flew on board Skylab mission for I think about 28 days, and I went, that's my path. So that's why I became a medical doctor. Everybody kind of asked, how did the medical doctor get involved in this? And just to take it, just a couple of, I know we don't have a lot of time, but I did pre-med, medical school at Mayo Clinic, and then did a fellowship in endocrinology studying bone loss as it occurs in space. Now, I don't know if do we have any budding astronauts out there? Okay, so one of the things that you have to be concerned about when you go into space is that we're all born in a gravity environment. We go into a microgravity environment, and all bets are off in terms of physiology. And I'm setting this up to get to the point of my transition. So I became an expert in space medicine we lose 1% of bone, 15% of our muscle mass, our heart shrinks in size, we can't fight off illnesses, and you know what I call that? Job security. So I used that then to become an astronaut, and then as you've alluded to, I did 2 missions in space. The point I want to make about that background is that I was involved in some of the development of the first medical equipment that was deployed in space and needed the ability to communicate to us here on Earth, and that we call remote medicine. And what do we call it now? Telemedicine. So that's what I've been involved in for the last 25 years or so, investing as a VC in telemedicine.
Yeah, amazing. And just got elected into the NASA Hall of Fame this past year, and his accolades can go on. Yes, pretty amazing.
Thank you.
So from your lessons in space, I want you to focus on 2 areas. How do you think about leadership, and how do you think about the pursuit of excellence?
Yeah. So I want to reverse that, and I want to talk about the pursuit of excellence, because I think that has really been the driving force for me as an individual. You know, you can imagine when you're applying to medical school or astronaut school, as we call it, you're competing against a lot of folks. In my class, there were 6,000 applicants, and they selected 23 of us. So I had to pursue excellence. You know, I had to find a field that I could become an expert in, and then let that sort of drive me to into the, eventually into the work that I began to do. And so that's always important. Another thing about healthcare and space flight is that it requires leadership, right? It requires that you look out and you see where the gaps are, you see where the issues are, and then you have to figure out how to address those. And that takes a fair amount of leadership. So with that choice, that allowed me to be in various leadership roles, not only with the government, with NASA, but eventually when I came out, I got involved with a lot of leadership around the community in Houston is where my home is.
And several boards that we'll touch on. So
several boards.
Yes. So we're very fortunate to have you as part of our team. You're super busy, you're in venture, you're on the board of MassMutual, RTX, formerly Raytheon, Texas Med Center, one of the largest in the world. So what do you, the time that you do have and the time you give us, besides that, what are you focused on? What's really exciting you right now as you think about venture, innovation, and technology?
Yeah, so I mentioned that when I transitioned out of NASA, I created a venture capital firm called Vesalius Ventures. And that got me into business, because up to that point, I had no experience. In fact, the mentor of mine, a guy by the name of Jack Gill, who runs Vanguard Ventures, I went to him and I said, I want to be a venture capitalist. And he looks at my resume and he says, I'm looking at this resume, but I don't see anything that indicates that you know anything about business. And I said, what are you talking about? You know, I've done all these things. I've run these multinational, multi-million-dollar programs within NASA. And he said this to me, which sort of kind of reset my mindset. He says, you have spent your lifetime figuring out how much money to spend by the end of the year and not how much money to make by the end of the year. And it was a big transition for me. So I went and got an MBA and then started working in business. That allowed me then to have the credibility in my community, starting in Houston, to now be able to bring my clinical experience, my technology development experience, and now my business knowledge into solving community problems. And so that attracted the attention of not only our local Houston Technology Center. I'm sure you guys have those technology centers that deal with entrepreneurs in the various cities that you're in, but also attracted the attention of my board work. which initially was in banking, believe it or not. I was my first publicly traded board was Sterling Bank, and then that eventually led me to other things like Salient and Bearings. I'm actually on the Bearings board too.
Got it. And so switching to kind of corporate strategy and innovation, you're at the intersection of all these areas. Where do you see the biggest disconnect today between corporate strategy and innovation? What's happening at the leadership and boardroom level?
Yeah, so you mentioned all the boards that we sit on. I actually on a number of the boards, not only in the audit committee but on the investment committee. And one of the things we look for is strategy, whether things that we invest in are going to meet the strategic goals and the financial goals of the company. And so a lot of times we get enamored with technology or something new. We've talked a lot about AI, but we don't necessarily spend the time that's necessary to figure out how those technologies are going to fit into the overall strategy of the company. So that's probably one of the first things that we look at. And as a board member, I also am in the position to remind the senior management team of not only that strategy, but they should also set out a vision for the company. And I cannot tell you, having worked with startups and also worked with Fortune, in this case, a couple of Fortune 50 companies, you can kind of get lost in just the day-to-day of running the company, and you miss out on a lot of opportunities.
Yep. So we have a AI accelerator we're building, and as a team, we've talked to dozens of corporates, and I like to say at least that AI adoption is not a technology problem, it's an organizational behavior and leadership problem. So what tensions are you seeing in the boardroom kind of to circumvent, right? A lot of us CVCs here are trying to navigate from the top, and the successful ones have the buy-in from the top. What tension are you seeing in the boardroom?
In reference to AI specifically?
And innovation in general.
Yeah, I can tell you that this year, probably starting last year, every company that I've been involved in, particularly the publicly traded companies, we have a discussion around AI. How do we utilize it to add efficiencies? There have been a lot of discussions about that from previous speakers. Bringing technology to bear to move the company from this level to the next level. But more importantly, I think I heard it was two meetings ago or discussions ago, where we're talking about that sometimes you forget that how your employees are already using AI and how that gets implemented. And I'll give you a prime example. We were, and I won't say which company it was, we were just in the throes of understanding what generative AI meant. And most of the employees had already been using it at home, and they were using it on the computer. And I remember at a board meeting, I raised my hand and I said, do we have any policies in place that really guide our employees about the use of AI? And they said, well, we have safeguards, but no, we haven't done that. And to me, it was like, wow, it should be obvious, but sometimes it's not. Now, we have changed, all the companies that we're involved in, we have implemented policies. And then there is the open nature of regenerative AI and the different versions of it there that also lends itself to losing your intellectual property. So that became a big concern for us.
Yeah. I mean, I like to say everyone's on their AI journey, us as individuals, first inning, fifth inning, third inning, and corporations as well, right? Where Fortune 50 companies a year ago didn't have an AI strategy, and others are so far along. So it varies. The variance is wide. What advice would you give? You said over there, we joked, don't throw me any, stick to softballs and don't surprise me. I like to surprise you. So what advice would you give to this crowd of mainly CVCs as they try and figure out adoption and innovation and working with a pretty dynamic world around innovation and AI and that we're seeing, and then you can throw in the whole macro layer. What advice would you kind of give folks as they think about this?
Yeah, and I guess the advice, knowing, I've got a chance to meet a number of you that have established venture funds within your corporation, and my advice is something that you've probably already heard. Again, it goes back to looking at what the corporate strategy is, what is the vision for the company, and make sure that what you're bringing to the table is going to align with that corporate strategy. You need, when you think about when you're bringing things forward, you're not only going to be trying to convince the senior management and the executive leadership team, but you're also got to keep the board in mind as we are. We have fiduciary responsibility for where the company is going. And so anything that you might bring needs to fit. And if it doesn't, we're going to call the CEO and the executive team on the carpet to say, how does this fit what we're doing? And I had a separate conversation with one of you that says that if you mess that up, right? If you bring the wrong deal to the table, a wrong innovation to the table, it could destroy your internal initiative. So you have to be careful of that.
Yeah, I think someone I spoke to said, literally, they'll pull the yank out of you and you're gone the next day. A relatively conservative Midwestern company. Someone mentioned that. I'm like, yeah. So it's really tricky getting it right.
As a venture capitalist, private venture company, I can make mistakes. In fact, that it's really good for us to get out there and make mistakes. And by definition, the way we set up our fund is that we know that probably only 25% of what we invest in is actually going to become of anything. And the rest, we know that this is the way the industry is, that is our business. But I think for corporate venture, you have a tougher road to hoe.
So some of the traits from space that you need to succeed, risk, systems thinking, all the things that are hard that we look for in founders, right? Ability to problem solve and solve hard problems. What are some of the traits that, as you're looking at deals and you're looking at founders and even CEOs, as leaders, what do you think is most important, right? Is it building a team, being able to lead and build a culture? What comes to mind?
Yeah, I think building a team, you've hit it, and culture. And since I am an astronaut, of course, I have to tell a little story. And it's a story that I think all of you have heard, have read, or even seen on the movie. Anybody remember Gene Kranz? So Apollo 13, when we were on our way to, I think it was going to be the second or third landing on the moon, and they had a catastrophic incident, and the crew almost didn't make it home. And Gene had those wonderful words that failure is not an option, right? And a lot of people have used that. Not because that failure is not an option, because failure is always an option. Failure is always an opportunity to learn if you have the right mindset. But he used that as a way in which to build culture within the organization, NASA organization, which still exists today. So as a CEO or as part of an executive team, it's your responsibility to build that culture and to let nothing disrupt that culture. And it's so important for companies to be successful.
So failure, probably it's still used to be a badge of honor in the Valley. You know this better than I do. Of like, how many companies did you fail and before you get it right? That's a just say tension for lack of a better word, because that badge of honor is also can be costly. You can't fail when you're in space. You probably have minimal opportunities to get things wrong.
Yeah.
Those traits are invaluable, but at the same time, as you just stated, you learn so much from that.
You do. And we have failed, right? We had Challenger, we had Apollo 1, we had Columbia and all those sort of things. And each time we learned from those failures, and we built in systems to prevent those particular failures from occurring, and then tried to establish within the organization safeguards, like a safety panel, for example, to begin to look at and develop processes so that we can keep those things from happening again. But we know in our business that there is an opportunity to not just lose money, but lose lives.
Yeah, great. So we think we're out of time, but look, as our firm, we're very fortunate to have Bernard involved in many ways, from deep tech to medical to space to leadership. We'll welcome to continue the conversation to learn more about what he's up to and what we're up to. So thank you all for participating. Great. Thank you.